Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Backyard Gardens podcast. We hope everybody's having an absolutely fantastic day. And it's another very special episode. Well, not really very special, but this is the first episode that is recorded on video and be released on video on YouTube. So come check us out. This is something that we've been trying to work on for a while, and we're back. So, yay. Go.
Oh, retake. There you go.
Somebody needs to clean their desk.
My cord was caught in here, and my desk was clean earlier in the week, but here we are.
Yeah, well, adding video had put a few more chords into the mix, but
Yeah.
yeah. So we've made changes in our gardens in the past, and it's not always works out the way we want it to. It's something that you do with a good intention, and this is the question will go to you in a second, Batavia. But for right now, to the listeners, I just want them to ask them: have you ever made a change in your garden that didn't work out the way you expected? Now it goes over to you, Batavia.
Yeah, that was weird,
It
but
was weird.
thank you. Was that millisecond enough for y'all to actually answer
It
when
was.
he asked you directly? Yeah. Yeah. I think most times the changes that I make that don't quite work out, I kind of know I have there's a hint of it not working out as I'm making it. Like I kind of know going in that I'm taking a chance. Now, of course, there are some things that I'm all in on. I think it's the best plan ever, and then they fail too. So, but most times it's I'm gonna give this a try.
Yeah, I
And
know for me, it's usually I think it's gonna work out perfect. And there's just no way it's not. And I look at it and I'm like, this was the best decision I've ever made. I feel great about this. And then, sometimes it all just falls through. And then
I'm
you're like,
forever hedging my bets, though. That's a part of it
are
too,
you?
though, right? Lowering my expectations going in.
Yeah. Well, if you'd like to support the Backyard Gardens podcast, you can do so by becoming a patron, or you can be an Apple subscriber. It is because of them that we were able to bring video back to everybody. So thank you to them. And you'll get an extra episode a month. And also, you can get seeds from us. We have our full line of seeds up. Discount code is YBBBB. There's 5 letters in it. One Y, Young Ben, Batavia, the Brave Botanical. That's where it came
It's
from.
only two B's for Batavia Botanical, but
The Brave. Remember, you added that in yourself. You
well,
coined
I
it.
did, but you didn't acknowledge it in the code, so there is that.
I don't know. It's 1 Y and 4 B's. How's that? So come get yourself a discount and help support the show. All right. Where do you want to go with this?
The way my mind works, I'm starting in the spring and working my way through
Are you doing
this
this year
early.
or just in? So in
You
general,
want to go back to?
we want to
Oh
go
shoot!
back. We're going
Strap
back.
in. All right, we're gonna be here a while.
Do we need to turn the time machine on?
No, man. I mean,
No. Okay.
I'll have to pull some in and out, but it's all good.
All right. So why don't you kick us off, ladies
Okay, sure.
first?
So because it's at the top of my list, and now I'll need some time to go back into the Wayback Machine to pull a couple of older ones out. Tomatoes, specifically tomatoes in the front yard in that first long bed. If you see my front yard garden, um, I mimicked the PVC pipe cage that I used in the backyard last year. That was a success last year. I set it up in the front yard. Um, and planted tomatoes and peppers as I've planted many years in my garden and as I did last year, kind of in a similar space. The key was it's similar, it's not the same. So the bed last year was like very much closer to 4 feet. The bed this year was 3.5 feet. And based on the orientation of the sun, there's more direct sun in the front yard garden compared to the backyard garden. So what ended up happening, peppers are sitting at the very edge of the bed. Behind the peppers are tomatoes. And I had like probably 4 feet tall tomatoes, but they were, excuse me, 4 feet tall peppers, but they were very, very stringy. They weren't bushy like you want your pepper plants to be. That's because they were fighting for sun. I spent the entire season battling, pruning, tomatoes more than I would trying to tie up pepper plants and all. And I think generally the pepper plants suffered the most, and the tomatoes did just okay.
Yeah.
So it's that one was actually when I was convinced 100% that that was going to work because it worked so well last year. And then also the space that I had last year, it was a tight squeeze, but I could get to the garden bed from either side. This year, I really comfortably only had one way to get in, and that created, kind of delays in me climbing in and getting to things and such. So
That's a big
um,
issue too. I mean,
access is such a huge issue.
man, I can't tell you like access, and you get to a point where you kind of box yourself in. It's kind of like painting yourself in a corner, you know what I mean? Or
Mhm.
mopping yourself in a corner. You ever done that? My son did that last night.
Diet.
Actually, he freaked out. He was like, "What do I do?" I'm like, "Just walk." He's like, "I can't walk. It's wet." I'm like, "Well, then just stand there for an hour. I don't care what you do." But so it was just the bed placement was the issue.
Well, the bed placement and the way that the sun kind of as it rises, so there's so much sun that's hitting those. And again, remember now they're fighting, the pepper plants are fighting for it.
Yeah.
So the tomato plants outgrew the peppers, of course, as you would
Right.
expect. They became bushy, as tomato plants do. They started impeding on the pepper plants, and I never came in soon enough to basically tame it all. So, you had pepper plants that had like the vines were or the stems were popping. They were breaking and the branches were breaking as I tried to get in there and navigate when things became overgrown. So I had plans on year one was in the backyard garden using the same kind of setup. Year two was going to be in the front yard garden in that first bed. I was going to move that setup to the bed right across the way in year three. Like I had it all mapped out, but it was such a pain this year. I'm nixing it. I'm not going to that, it's twin bed next year.
Yeah.
So combination of things. And that bed is metal. So when I connect the netting to the metal, it gave a lot more room for squirrels to climb in. Where
Mm.
in the backyard is wood. So it's about, what's that, about 2 inches thick or something. So the fasten was much tighter, if that
So are
makes
we
sense.
talking about a weakness in the metal beds?
We're talking about a weakness in the cage that I created, like in
Okay.
the design.
So that it was the engineer.
Yeah. As it always seems to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did you fix it? Or
I didn't. I ended up pulling peppers earlier than I ever pulled them. So
right?
I intentionally wanted to pull out my tomato plants early. We
Oh,
talked about this a number of different times on the show. And so I did that at the beginning of September. And as I got a good look at the peppers, it just really wasn't worth saving. The amount of peppers those plants produced were fewer than I've had experience with those same types of varieties. It wasn't a throwaway necessarily. I mean, I got some good fruit off of those plants, but I know that space can produce more. That same bed, it's a slightly different orientation just based on it being further into the yard. I had like dozens of bell peppers and like size peppers last year. And while I didn't plant the same number, I just again know that space can produce. And this year was nothing like that.
right.
So
Yeah, that's a
I've
tough.
had other stuff grow well there. It's just the combination of those two things. And then if you tie in my neighbor's landscape guy told me instead of five, I needed like three. And he was right. So instead of five tomato plants, three would have been more ideal. But
Yeah,
no one asked him.
you know we have to do the show, and it'll be after the first of the year, but we're gonna do a show about spacing. There's a lot to talk about there, and that's something that I mean, I don't know this for a fact, but as we talk through this, I would imagine that a lot of this talk the spacing will come up periodically throughout this conversation. It's one of those things that I think we fight with the most as gardeners. And for me, I kind of go on the same thing where, and I don't know if you remember this, Batavia. Do you remember when I called you? This is a couple years ago, and I had put up the trellises, and then I was going to put up the tunnels, and I was like, man, my garden's starting to look like an erector set.
Mm-hmm.
And I was kind of worried about it. And it's worked pretty good for the time being. And what ended up happening is I put the tunnels up. They're fine, kind of, and we'll get into that later too. But one of the beds, or two of the beds, have a trellis in the back, and it works really good when I have something on the trellis. But when I don't have something on the trellis, I could not get into the back of the bed, and it was really an issue. So as I would grow, and it's the way I grow, and I mean, look, I could probably change my plan a little bit, but I don't really want to do that too much. I kind of like the way I do it. I'm kind of stubborn, so there's not much I can do, but I would have to reach through the trellis in order to get parts of the bed, because otherwise, my beds are 4 feet wide, which is really good to an extent. But when you get into reaching, I mean, that's a far reach when you're trying to dance over plants and stuff like that. And I didn't really, I was just having a lot of issues. So I ended up getting that mosaic virus last year. Remember that?
Yeah.
And I ended up going back and putting cucumbers in this year. Well, that gave it the cucumbers a mosaic virus. So I ended up removing that trellis completely. And that really helped, because then all of a sudden I could get into that bed and work. And so it made my mind think. And I'm currently looking to reposition trellises a little bit, because I am a big trellis gardener and I do believe in having them, and I like growing things that trellis. So it just saves so much space. But when I removed that trellis and I was able to get to that back row, it kind of changed the game for me completely, because not only can I get to the back row, but I can get in the row in front of it easier. So there's just a lot more, and I don't have to do that weird yoga dance to get in it. So it's just it was a really good idea, and I was convinced that it was going to work. Absolutely convinced. But as it went through and we did it each year, I kind of noticed it. And then once I got the mosaic virus 2 years in a row, I was like, okay, I removed the trellis so I wouldn't be tempted to put anything else on it,
Yeah.
because I'm stubborn, and I didn't even look to see what could get the mosaic virus. I just kind of went for it. And once I removed it, I was like, oh yeah, absolutely. So we're looking, and the bed next to it's even worse, because I have a trellis on it, and then I have the tunnel on the other side, so it's boxed in at a 90-degree angle, and I can only get in on two sides. So it's really complicated, and I'm looking to change that as well. I need to keep it so one section is blocked, and even that I need to be very careful about that as well.
Yeah, I was trying to look and see, and I don't want to make a declaration, but
No, don't do that.
it looks like the trellis that I have, the cattle panel, the infamous cattle panel trellis that I have basically two sets in the front yard garden. That was the vision. That was the initial design. In 2019, when I broke ground on the front yard garden, that was what I needed to add to it. Like that completed the look. And I was just checking, and I think almost half of the years, the trellis has been filled, like as I expected, like things have actually trellised up and vine and crops have grown. Then the other half, the more recent years, it's not. I've had an empty trellis. And
You've had an
it's
empty trellis
interesting.
in your garden for the past couple of years?
Yeah.
How does that make you
Not
feel?
intentionally. Say again.
How does that make you feel?
Oh, it didn't make me happy at all.
No,
That's where
it's
I'm headed.
terrible, isn't it? It
Yeah,
hurts.
I'm headed to like, Frownyville, dude. Like it's like that's such a stark reminder of like for lack of a better term, a fail.
Yeah.
Like that wasn't part of the design this year. That wasn't part of the design last year when it was empty. And it wasn't part of the design the year before when it was empty. But here we are with an empty trellis. And now I'm going into next year thinking, all right, let's get back to our method for the first 3 years when I actually had a full trellis. But what it has done, it's reminded me, because I'm not picking food from the actual trellis, it reminded me how difficult it is to get to the beds the trellises are sitting basically, adjacent to, right? And so it's like clearly I've grown food without anything growing on these trellises. I'm not, again, this is not a declaration, but I wonder what it would be like to garden without that trellis there, without those two sets. I would have basically there are four sides to the beds. I'd have access to three sides.
Yeah.
And remember, I put those little narrow beds in between to try to expand the growing space, which makes it even more difficult to get inside of either of the beds that are sitting in the front yard garden. So
Right.
I've literally, I'm like young David. I've painted myself into a corner where I can access these beds from this side or this side, and that's it.
Yeah.
And in the beginning of the season, it's like everything's gravy. It's all good. But let something get 2 feet tall, like I'm like quite literally climbing inside of the bed to pull out the plants.
Yeah, that's how I am too. And you said something that really rung in my head, and it's in the beginning of the season, it's great. But and it always seems that way, doesn't it? It's like the beginning of the season, everything works out, everything is good, it's all kosher. And I mean, your grandmother, was it your grandma that had this saying, the garden runs wild towards the end of, and it does. And once things start growing and getting big and taking over, then that's when the issues arise when it comes to this
Yeah.
stuff. So you know, trellises are a love of mine, but I'm actually thinking this year of adding another cattle, not a cattle panel, a hog panel. Have you
What's the
seen those?
difference?
It's a hog
No.
panel's half the size.
Oh, okay, okay.
It's the same length, but it's half the width.
Hmm.
So that would be enable me to have a little bit more space. This year I had that Seminole pumpkin just go absolutely insane. You know what? It doesn't need a whole 4 foot trellis, 4 foot wide trellis. I could get away with a plant on a 2 foot wide trellis and then have another 2 feet in front of it once it goes to be able to get inside of my garden and work. Access
Yeah.
is everything. And I don't want to harp on this too much, but getting out of your way and eliminating friction is going to help your garden dramatically, no matter how you look at it. You're going to be able to get in there and work and weed and fertilize and dig and harvest and remove everything a lot faster than if you did, if you paint yourself in a box like that.
But there's a thing to consider when it comes to the spaces we're growing in. Of course, we're trying to make the most of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That trellis in the front yard was the most traditional of trellises in my garden, right?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely was a permanent structure. Like other trellises that I create, like they may come down at the end of the season. I may not leave them up the next season. It's been there since 2019. And that has been the only place that's made sense for me in my garden mind to grow melons. Now, ask me if I've grown melons in these last 3 years when there's been an empty trellis.
Have you grown melons on the trellis in the last 3 years since it's been empty?
No, no, I've not. That's yeah, like, and it's the when you said the hog panels and it's half the size. I thought about this for a split second. It just triggered that memory. Like, what if the entire set of beds is a 10-foot long bed? So two, if you're watching the video, hey, so two 10-foot long beds are sitting basically here. And then there's the trellis that goes over it, creating that hoop, if you will. And then there are two small, narrow beds sitting inside of the trellis, right? But it's 10 feet. Do I really need all 10 feet of that trellis, even? So, what I thought about a couple of years ago is what if I just removed one? At least I'd be able to get to half of the bed easily.
Right.
So a part of making the most of your space. And then to be quite frank, what do you do with all of this stuff? That's a pretty big structure to take down and move somewhere in my garden space. So it's
Yeah.
almost left up by default. Now again, I'm not making any declarations. I'm not saying I'm going to stop growing on this trellis. Stop trying to grow on the trellis because I've not been growing on the trellis the last few years. But it's something. It's going back to our subscriber episode. Sometimes you have to stop and consider: do I need to tear it all down and start over? You know, I'm going
Yeah,
to use that loosely.
rip it all out.
Hmm, hmm.
Yeah, it's not something that's a pleasurable thought, but I mean, there's a benefit to starting with a blank slate and starting over. And I mean, so what? We're just referring to trellises right now, but you pull the trellises out and you start over. You already have done the work in the soil, the garden beds. It's all that still there. Nobody's saying really removing that unless you have to, but as far as like the structures and stuff like that, it's not really the end of the world. There's a lot more that you can do, and removing that stuff can make or break a garden, I think, and really revitalize that space so you could do more with it.
I think one of the first steps that we often don't take is taking a step back and really determining whether or not it's serving you well.
Mm-hmm.
Like it may have served me well those first 3 years, and maybe it doesn't. Or maybe it served me really well, and then I tried to enhance it further, and I basically undercut myself,
Yeah.
right? I undid the good that was already kind of I developed in that space. So it's something to think about. I have a couple of explanations as to why here we are year 3 on not growing, on the trellis. And I feel like I still want to use that space for that purpose, but I have to be super intentional about it, you
Right.
know.
Yeah. Um, I think we need to move on from trellises though.
I'm okay
They're
with that.
depressing me. I'm starting to
Empty
get sad.
trellises is where we're moving up. That's the
Yeah, we
move.
need. Let's talk about filling up trellises. No, so I have a lot, but
Hmm.
there's some that I need to pull back on because our yearly garden fails episodes coming up,
Sure.
and there's a number of things that did not work out this year. So I'm trying to withhold that information and really go back further because earlier on, each year you progress and you learn more and more, and I want to focus, at least for myself, on the earlier stuff because there was a lot of trial and error that did and didn't really work, So that's something that I think would benefit both of us, is going back in the time machine a little bit. As far as like, well, I don't really want to give you a category because I don't know a category. I was trying to think of like,
You're debating with yourself quite literally right
I
now.
know. I literally am having a conversation with myself on air. It's super embarrassing, but that's okay. I do that. It's one of those things where we usually have like a list and categories to go over, but we don't have that today. And I don't think we need one though, because every garden is individual. So let you be the one that says the category for the next one. How's that? Go.
Is it back to me?
I think so.
All of that talk, I thought you were leading up to another one.
No, I was, and then I was thinking that I did one and you didn't do one, so we like to go back and forth like that, so it's even airtime.
Okay. All right. Tell all the secrets. All right. So my next one is, and this has been a year over year over year.
Oh boy.
Yeah. It's my great ideas of what to grow in containers. And what I end up doing is trying this new thing in a container and not trying the thing that I know consistently works in a container. And the things that when you talk about containers and whether or not, you're going to be successful or not, size of the containers matter. Generally speaking, the space they're in matters, how much sun that space gets, your watering habits, and your fertilizing, right? Like
Yeah.
all those things lead into whether or not a container is going to be successful or not. So in my growing area, let me say that our climate is mild enough even during the summer where we're not seeing things dry out in a day's time, but there still is the need to make sure that we're watering. So I have consistently over the years said I'm going to start out planting in containers, and then I'll have however many containers growing food in the spring and summer going into the fall. And I said, let's look at this and let's change this up where I'm only growing in 2 seasons, right? And each maybe every other year, I run into the I mean, it's just it doesn't work. If I don't keep those spaces actively growing, I'm not actively growing in them, right? Soil dries up, and it makes it more difficult for me to work with that soil and that space the next time I'm coming around to plant in it. So my original was plant in the containers you're going to plant in all season long. I tried to change that and say, let's only focus in certain times of the year. And that's it's just I have to keep at it, if that makes sense, but
Yeah.
growing the right things at the right time. So a good example was, um, growing leafy greens in containers, and that works for me well in the cooler months, and I decided, "Alright, I'm not gonna grow in these containers maybe in the summer," and that sounds good until I realized that those containers get the most and the best sun during the summer. Everything is so much lower in the sky in the spring and in the fall. So I'm missing a window even that can be taken advantage of. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I hate that you brought up containers.
I knew you would.
Yeah. I I let that pause stay there for dramatic effect, just so you know. Yeah. You know, I did container. I added 4 or 5 large containers a couple years ago, and I did well with them. I got my hands on some really big pots, and I was like, cool, let's do this. And man, I really have come to realize in the past 2 years that I really just don't enjoy growing in containers as much. It adds a level of they're very needy. You know, it's hard because you got to water them all the time, and then things act differently in them, and I can't stay on top of them with everything I've got going on in my space.
Mhm.
So I've gone back and forth, and I remember I was actually going through my YouTube the other day, and I saw where I'd done a video is the best fall container garden I've had in years, and it really was. It was great. But ever since then, they kind of fell off, and my interest kind of waned from it more and more. But now I've got these giant containers that I just don't know what to do with them. I've got these huge containers, and I just don't feel like growing in them. So I'm trying to figure out how to do it as well. But I don't think it necessarily went bad. Not yet, you know. I think it's getting to where it could go bad, but it's not bad as of yet. I just need to find a purpose for them now that I've got them. And I mean, you can't even move them. They're so big. I'd have to hook them up to the tractor and pull them away. And I don't really want to do that because it's a waste. And I mean, I went to go put soil in them, and I got a soil dump, and I was like, man, these things take a lot of soil. So I'm like adding it in. And so I'm restructuring how that works. And when I look into my garden, there are things that I think would do good in a container, but I don't think they're absolutely necessary.
Mhm, mhm, yeah. I mean, I do think that there is some logic for the win. Win makes better sense in certain people's areas, but I think it's the maybe you and I were talking offline. Like I thought maybe I would just grow in the spring and other than peppers, kind of skip over the summer for containers. You know, I have my vertical ones, but for the regular kind of standalone containers, I'd skip over them. And what I realized is that one, I'm missing that growing space. Two, like, I'm not gonna be hauling those containers back and forth. So they're just gonna be sitting. It's almost like dead space, you know? And so I think you have to consider all of those, like the number of a thing doesn't make necessarily equal success of a thing. So, you know, growing in more doesn't always equal success, you know? So that's something to consider. All right, so you're up.
Oh, I'm up. Great. I hate talking about stuff I don't do well in the garden. It brings up a lot of thoughts that drive me crazy. Um, so the containers was definitely one of them, but also my irrigation situation was something that was a real issue for a long time. And again, I was just too stubborn because as my garden grew, I didn't grow my irrigation with it. And that was something that I wish I would have gone back and really noticed that, like, this needs to change. This needs to be something different. When you have a smaller garden, and I mean, truth be told, our gardens really aren't the biggest gardens there are, but um, you when you start spreading them out and you getting bigger and bigger and your sprinkler doesn't cover them, you have to go in deeper. And I fought it for so long and I went through so much. And I mean, I made the investment, which was the real issue, was the investment. I had to fork over the cash to put in the drip lines that I have now. But once I did that, it worked out well. But I started with a sprinkler and I had it in the middle of the garden and it worked fine. And then the garden grew and then that worked good. But then I started thinking about it and looking at the design of my garden and thinking, like, where else can I put something and what else can I do with it? And so I put a bed in the back, and then all of a sudden the sprinkler wasn't hitting it. And so I said, okay. And I made it work. And then I went through and I added the cattle panel trellises and they worked out well, but now the sprinkler couldn't hit those well. And so I went through a solid season of those not really getting watered well and the growth wasn't very good. And so I was starting to look around and try and find a different method to do it, different irrigation setup. And I got some drip irrigation stuff from like Lowe's or something, and it was absolute garbage. And so I went through and I ran it, and I realized, like, this just isn't working out. I wasn't getting enough water, so then I had to take it out and I had to go back. And the whole time, what's going on is I'm getting less and less production. And I mean, I'm not trying to make this a factory farm by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm trying to be productive and I'm trying to feed my family to the best of my ability. And I just wasn't really hitting on much for the best of my ability aspect of it. So then we go back and I got this. What I typically did is I started making my own sprinklers, and I would get the in-ground irrigation sprinkler heads, hook them up to PVC pipe, and then put a fitting on it for a garden hose, and then I could get more spray and so that worked for a while. But it was just one of those things, like, it just, every time I did it, I was eliminating another part of my garden. I just could not really get the water to where it needed to be. And I mean, in the summertime, it's a big deal because it gets hot and the soil dries out a lot. I mean, right now, for instance, we're seeing that it's not really, it's not super hot and we haven't had any rain, but the water is lasting longer. We got our first
Mhm.
sprinkle the other day, very light rain. And what that did, it coated the ground, but it stayed on the ground. Whereas in the summertime, it would dry up immediately. So, noticing that and seeing it, I was able to pull it through in the fall, but the summer I really struggled and I had a hard time doing it. And it was just, I was dancing around. I would change it and then I'd change it again. And I knew in the back of my head what needed to happen. I knew it and I just wouldn't do it. And then once I made that change, finally it worked out. And it's had some kinks in it. It's not been a totally smooth process, but it's been a lot easier and the watering has been a lot more consistent, which is what I needed. So I part of the mistake here was, one, growing the garden, which wasn't really a mistake, but it wasn't growing everything with the garden. I was looking at the dirt space and not the watering, not the light issues, not all the other stuff that comes with the garden growing. And the same can be said for the wild garden as well. I mean, we added that in and it just added another level of complexity.
Yeah, I think I mean, irrigation is the one of the least popular topics we discuss, but it's one of those that's so key. Like, it seems like it's all intuitive, but it's
Mm-hmm.
not. And so generally speaking, there's a window of time where I just fall down on it, you know, um, and it's probably at the height of the growing or harvesting because I'm so distracted to do the other things,
Yeah.
right? Like, I am. It's similar to my house plants where I come back in and water when the plants tell me to because they're like, "Try." Yeah, so there's a time where my outside garden looks that same way. So this is one I don't know if we've ever talked about this, at least from my perspective. Um, some of the crops that we harvest in bunches versus as we need them. So you look at things like potatoes, right? For me, I like my peppers to mature to whatever the color is that they're supposed to mature to be, from green to purple, right? Green to red. And I basically, some years back, decided that I was going to do big haul harvest. It's easier for me to manage the veggies that way. Like, if I'm trying to do some preservation, you have enough to do whatever that preserving dish is or dishes. But what I end up doing when I made that shift was you're leaving vegetables in the garden, and there's a risk for weather damage. There's a risk for, you not managing them and them staying, too dry, getting too wet. There's a risk that animals or bugs will attack. So it's that idea of, oh, I'm going to take this big, gathering of all of these vegetables versus picking 4 or 5 peppers at a time versus putting your hand down in the soil and picking up a couple of potatoes. So that wait and get the big haul was an intentional change in my garden. And I don't want to say that it exactly went bad, but it's not been a success each time. And when I realized that, I stop and say, I can think back in a lot of cases where I'm like, oh, I should have came in and harvested those few. And then I wait to harvest the many.
Right.
And, you know,
Can I
it
ask
leads
you?
to success.
Can I ask you real quick? When you say big haul harvest, was it? Were you referring to like leaving them out there longer so you can get most of them at once, or?
Yep.
Okay,
Mhm.
yeah. I kind of I do that for certain things,
Mhm.
but again, we're encroaching into this year's issues, and I'm trying to hold
Well, I
back.
didn't ask you to come along with me.
Oh, I
I can
can't
look
help
across
it.
my years and
I can't help it. It's like a drug because I don't
Mhm.
want you to feel bad by yourself. I want you, misery loves company. That's a real
Mhm.
thing.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I did that this year with my tomatoes. I grew Ace Bush 55 tomatoes. We have those in the seed store. I loved growing them. They were exactly what I was looking for. They were a determinate type slicing heirloom tomato. There's a whole lot of requirements that I wanted, and I found it. And so we grew it, and I got nice sized tomatoes. At the same time, I wanted to do big haul harvest for it, just like you did. I never thought about naming it that. I like that term. But what happened was the raccoons were eating them, and the
Mm.
problem wasn't that he was eating them. The problem was that he got to know that they were there, so he could depend on that food source. That was the true issue, and I told myself like next year I'm just I mean, I would go out there and I would find tomatoes that he chewed up, and they, nice 8 ounce tomatoes that he would have taken bites out of. And I'm not gonna, I don't want raccoons spitting my food,
Yeah,
so I
right.
just kind of backed off. But he knew that food source was there. So next
Yeah.
year, I told myself I was like, look, you're just gonna have to harvest them when they're not quite ripe. They're blushing. Just go
Yeah.
ahead and get them. And I had the same issue last year. I had a Better Boy tomato that I grew on my porch, and he was coming up and eating them. And so I got wise, and I was like, all right, well, we'll just pull them off.
Mhm.
And he went away because we were able to keep him from, he would come and he was like, he didn't want the green tomatoes. He only wanted the red ones. So we were able to do that. But I'm with you on that one. That's a tough one. And it's because it's sexy to come in with a basket full of perfectly ripe tomatoes that you
Yeah.
can
You know
put on
what
the
though?
counter and eat right away.
I'm great with the tomatoes, harvesting them early, but then they sit on my dining room table and I lose track of as they ripen. So I had more loss for tomatoes that came into the house. And then as a tomato has a distinct smell. And as I walk, through the living, it's a small little like shared space. Well, it's open concept. No, because the kitchen isn't open. But anyway, a little shared space where the dining room is in one space and the living room is in another. As soon as I hit the stairs and I'm in the little space for the living room, I could smell the tomatoes. I'm like, "Gosh." Like, that basically you're smelling an overripe piece of fruit. So that was a thing, but it kind of goes back to, and I'm only about 6 years into growing root crops. So I'd say peppers and any root crop, I suffer from this greatly. So peppers, again, I want them to get that color on them. I saw a video from like either last year or the year before, and I had just like the entire bed full of green peppers. Luckily, I didn't have much loss, but that's a real risk.
Yeah.
Like you just have this fruit sitting here. I know a California Wonder pepper is gonna taste better once it gets red, and I believe red on the vine, right? I
Yeah.
don't see evidence to that, but I really took a risk, and to be I guess you could say it paid off last year, but you gotta be considerate because more and more people are finding animals are finding that food source. Now, the root crops, I feel like every year I've harvested root crops, there's an indication that they've been in the ground too long. Like, the carrots start getting the little hairs on them, like, is that a sprout on that potato? Right. So I have, because it's out of sight, out of mind, so to speak. I have a terrible habit of leaving those veggies in the ground, quite literally, longer than they should. I'm talking by weeks. I had that same experience with my garlic. So my expectation is to pull them all out at the same time. And if even if I practice pulling a few out early, I would know the rest of them are really ready.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if I could break myself of that, how easy it's to break myself of that habit either.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's part of the learning process too about when to harvest stuff. It's really, there's a fine line, especially for root
Mhm.
crops.
Mhm.
And I mean, carrots don't really give you that, that tall
Yeah.
tale sign. I mean, you can see them shouldering and stuff like that, but when we pull up the carrots, you do a light harvest and you'll start to see them and okay, we're getting close. So that'll work out good, but it's hard to really go out there and do these big haul harvests all at once and get them all. And I typically do my carrots in two pieces. So actually three. So the first time I go out, I'll get them and they'll be, baby carrots. And then the next time I'll get thinner carrots. And then the final one, I'm like, okay, I'm going to wait a couple weeks and then they're going to be wide open. And so then we get our bigger carrots. So we'll do that. Our tomato or potatoes, though, they give you indication right off the bat that they're going to work out. So
Well, yeah, but
it's
what
not
ends
an
up
issue.
happening is the whole dieback stage with some of these crops. Boy, like, the body starts to break down by the time I start digging them out, like, they've died back, but I mean, decomposition has started. So yeah, it's something to consider, and, it's as we talk about this, and the reason one of the reasons why this is important, as you look across some of these, you know, changes that didn't quite work out, you can kind of picture, like, the potential loss.
Yeah.
So I go into next year saying I really want to focus on, shelf stable crops coming out of the garden. So that does speak to a lot of root crops. But if I'm missing a window, a prime opportunity to pull these veggies out when they're in their prime, they're the freshest, then I'm kind of like I'm shooting myself in the foot. So that is definitely in part there's the experience. I think I learned a couple of years ago with some of these though, but I still like I waited probably at least 10 days too long for my garlic. I should have harvested it a week and a half prior, right? And so it's the discipline I think more than anything. It's the fighting the urge to say, "Oh, I'll get to it." I love a good project, and harvesting garlic somehow has become a project for me. Um, yeah, you know,
Yeah.
that's probably one of my bigger things as far as I made a distinct change in the way that I manage these veggies. Coupled with there are many more of them, so that was a part of the reason why the change made sense. And year over year, it's just not worked out as well for me.
Right. Um, can I do the last one? Can I
Mhm.
do a together one for us?
Yeah.
So we both did wood chips in our garden, and I
Mm.
did not want this episode to go through without it because it did not work the way we wanted by any stretch of the imagination. Um, and so what I'm referring to is we went through and both of us, I mean, Batavia, was it the same year? Did we do it? I can't remember.
I think just by coincidence it was.
I think it was.
I think it was 2000. No, maybe not because it was.
I think you were a
I'm
year
pretty
before
sure.
me.
Yeah, I think I may have encouraged you too, which I still carry a level of guilt about.
You should. You should. How do you sleep at night with that guilt? I don't understand. Do you lay your head on your pillow and feel comfortable at night?
I barely sleep, brother. I sleep in 2 hour increments. I wake up yelling and screaming,
That's
"No more wood chips."
so this is a very controversial one. It's so we both did it. Batavia put it in her garden, and then I don't think she really convinced me to help her out a little bit. It was more like it was something I had been thinking about. I wanted to get a good solid mulch in my garden and something that would last for the year and I didn't have to keep reapplying. And it's something that we've done in flower beds my whole life. My family has done it, and it was just every spring you went and you got a load of wood chips and you put them in and you revitalized them. So I added them into the garden myself, and I did not have what I thought was going to be good success with that. It definitely things definitely did not grow well. The water could not penetrate as well. There was a lot of nitrogen tie up, which I didn't realize at first. Because one thing, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Batavia, but flowers and vegetables grow differently
Mhm.
and they need different nutrients and the nitrogen tie up like I said in my whole life I never saw issues like I had with the vegetables and as I grew into this and did it more and more I started reading that you had to fertilize a lot more to combat it in the first year and
Mhm.
then you could go and you would expect for it to get better and better each year and that was not my experience at all. I went through a whole season. I fertilized. What I realized is because I use an organic fertilizer, the key with organic fertilizer is it has to come in contact with the soil in order to start to break down. And once it starts to break down, it will feed your soil, which in turn will feed your plants. And I could not get it down because the wood chips were there. And I know, truth be told, if I would have run it for another year or two, it probably would have corrected itself. But I was having such bad experience with it that I had to pull it out because I'm still, what are we now, 3, 4 years later? I still feel the effects from it, and it is getting better in the lines of like I get roly polies really bad from it, and I mean the reason why is because as that stuff broke down, because I couldn't get it all out.
It's decaying
It's
matter,
decaying
right?
matter that they're attracted to, and so my seedlings I struggle with direct, I don't struggle with seedlings, but like direct sowing at certain times
Mhm.
I will. I get a lot of them in there and I'm constantly pulling them out, and it's been an ongoing issue ever since. I never had it before in any vegetable garden I've ever had until I put those wood chips down, and it's plain and simple. It just did not work for me. And I know a lot of people preach about it from the rooftops. A lot of
Yeah.
people.
So just quickly, the wood chips are using wood chips as mulch inside of your beds or your containers. And I did it for, I guess I'd say 1 year for sure, maybe 2 years. And I don't know that I was paying enough attention to notice that there was some harm done to the plants. It was just a pain as I tried to amend beds. I was really raking wood chips back at the end of every year, each of those seasons, growing years. And it was such a pain. And I could never get enough wood chips kind of to come to the edge of the bed. And now, as you mentioned, kind of the effects later, I use, shredded leaves instead of wood chips now. It's still decaying matter. And I use wood chips in my walkway. And I was sitting here thinking to myself, like, this may be the shove I need. The wood chips I get are free. That's the reason why, it was a primary source. It was
Yeah.
perfect for, the mulch and then for my walkway in the front yard garden. And I've wanted to do like the gravel for years and years, but just didn't want to pay for it. There's something to be said about the roly poly um, like colony that I have now. And
So
know
bad.
that it's still like they're churning away inside of the wood chips that I'm even using at the ground level.
Yeah.
So there's that. Yeah, it's in these spaces we're dealing with are so much smaller than when I've seen kind of the big recommendation about how wood chips can improve things for you. Like these folks are putting wood chips down, creating soil, coming back 2 or 3 years later,
Yeah.
right? You know, and that's not the approach you or I were taking in our garden. So
I mean,
yeah,
look,
that's
it may have been operator error. It
mm,
may have been at the time, but it just did not work for me because I don't want to buy a load of wood chips and then put them in a pile, let them sit for a couple years, and then come back. And I know that that works out well, and that's something that is definitely doable. But for me, it's putting it in the garden and letting it continuously work and break down and do the things that you do. And I didn't do that, but I never anticipated it was the worst garden I've ever had ever the year that I used wood chips. And it was one thing. I was trying to do something good, and I had no weeds, I will tell you that. But I had zero, and not zero, but everything just really struggled, and it was a constant battle. I was having to feed over and over and over and over again. And then at the end of it, it was just like when I pulled all that mulch back, I was shocked about what I saw underneath. And then the next year, I think I pulled it out, but I didn't go crazy and like dig it out or anything. I just got the bulk of it out,
mhm,
and then I put it in the flower garden. It did work. But I think it's great for walkways, flower beds, stuff like that. But
mhm,
even flower beds, I kind of wonder if it's like, I don't know. I mean, I'm not trying to like of the tiers of mulch. So wood mulch is the worst mulch for me. It's at the
mhm.
bottom of the barrel. I wouldn't use it unless I absolutely had to, or if it was well rotted mulch.
Yeah, I definitely do. I haven't, topped off my flower beds in quite a while, but I don't know, it's not on my list of things to consider for next year, so I don't even know if I have the capacity to kinda reconsider the not that you've asked me to, but the wood chip specifically for my walkway. The roly-polies are maddening for the reasons you described. Like, that's it's competing with the cabbage butterfly for me when it comes to the damage that they do. And every season I have the kind-hearted argument with someone online, or someone tries to point out to me online how they only eat dying matter, decaying matter. Like, no, dude, they're absolutely eating these new seedlings. They're absolutely eating the
Absolutely.
leaves of some transplants, depending on how close they are to, to the soil
100%.
line.
Yeah,
Like,
100% do. And just for the record, we call them roly polies, not pill bugs, because at heart we're still 5 years old. That's how it works. So,
have you
um,
ever seen a picture of baby Batavia? Oh,
no,
I
our
gotta show you a
relationship
picture
hasn't
of
gone to
baby
that level.
Batavia. It's a special kind of thing. Yeah.
Oh
Mhm.
wait, I think I saw a picture of you. Um, man, remember the hair ties with the balls, the big
Oh,
plastic.
I was like a teenager or something then.
Oh, were you? Yeah,
No,
I
I'm
saw
talking like
those.
hold your parent's hand as you're crossing the street,
Like
baby Batavia.
when I saw the picture I'm referring to, I remember it threw me right back to being in elementary school. I was
Oh,
like,
oh,
man, it's,
okay. Oh, like the barrettes and the hairball. Okay, maybe it
I
was.
don't know what that stuff's called.
You could use a dose of baby Batavia even if you have never if you've seen it or not. So, that's my gift to you.
Yeah, just just so you know, I was out surfing this morning, and my friend was like, "What size wetsuit are you wearing?" And I was like, I mean, it's a XXL. And she was like, "Well, what size is it? Like I'm wearing a 10." I'm like, "I don't know. I don't wear anything with a number. Everything I have is letters on it, It's I don't know what everything's called, but I do recognize it. But no, that picture, I remember seeing it. It was amazing. But
Baby botanical Batavia.
baby botanical Batavia. But we got to get to the listener question of the day. But before we do, I just want to say, because we're running short on time, the Planner app is a sponsor of the show. Check it out to help you plant your garden and really get you going in the right way. There's a link below to get you a discount on it. So check out the Planner app. We thank them very much. We love using the app, and we will be featuring it and talking about it on the show more as we get into planning season, because it is the garden season 2.0, is it not? All
Of course.
right. So our listener question of the day comes from is emailed to us at bygquestion at gmail.com if you want to send us a question. It's from Aaron. So this is actually an interesting take on overwintering, and I don't. You have to. I'm interested to see what you're going to say about it, Batavia. It says, hello, I love the show, and it has inspired me to plant a fall garden as well as filling my garden with my excess peas from my spring and cover crop. So first of all, awesome that you started fall garden. I'm glad that we could do that. And it says, my question is in regards to overwintering plants. I have tried to overwinter pepper plants and ran into pest and overwatering issues, and I'm trying again. However, this year, I found out that you can bare root tomato plants and keep them in the fridge. Do you have any experience with this? Thanks, Aaron.
Hey,
I didn't give you
Aaron.
time. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know that's everyone watching saw me saying this is exactly how it happens.
They
This is
didn't
how it happens.
because we switched the camera angle away from you, so you couldn't see you.
I was in here fighting the air. um,
What do you think? Bare
I
rooting
guess
tomato
I.
plants.
So I had this on the list, but it didn't seem appropriate. I used to take my house plants outdoors, and then I had like a whole issue with a raccoon hiding inside of like where all the house plants were kind of sitting on my porch. And since then, I've not taken them out, and it's a little bit sad for me. But I also, when I used to take them out before, Raccoon Gate, I'm bringing these things back out that have been living outdoors for all of this time. And so it takes me back to a time where I'm pretty sure, was it carrots? I had some small container that I brought in. I'd sowed carrot seeds indoors, and I had the worst bug problems. And so for me, it's hard for me to even give advice on this thing because I kind of feel like things that are inside can go outside, but I have real pause around intentionally bringing things back in, especially if, again, for tomato plants, like what's the gain other than maybe a couple of weeks, maybe?
Yeah.
I'd never, Aaron, this is not a judgment, but I would never put a tomato plant, even the root of it, in my refrigerator.
Well, let me do this. Let's break it. Let's break a tomato plant down in the function of it.
Okay,
Don't
here we
roll
go.
your eyes on camera because you don't forget we're on
I
camera.
just looked down at the coffee
I know
cup.
you did, but this
Well,
is the moment
and
when
it's
you would
video
normally roll
one
your
for
eyes.
them. It's gonna take 3 or 4 videos for them to realize that's my on camera roll my eyes. I'm just gonna look down at my coffee
Yeah, I
cup.
could tell. I could tell. So, no, seriously. So, the key that I want to look at is putting it in the fridge. There's a lot of functions here for that, and it's plant specific. Now, what we know about plants is they need what?
Light.
Photosynthesis, light, right? Now, there is, so in my world of growing bonsai, this is an absolute method. And
Mhm.
what this is, so if you grow a maple tree, for instance, right? And that maple tree needs to have a period in the winter where it gets really cold and it doesn't have leaves on it, so it's not doing photosynthesis. And in places like tropical places and stuff like that, people will actually take their plants, their trees of this nature, their deciduous trees, and they will put them in the refrigerator for a period of time to meet the requirements so that it can go. Because otherwise, what will happen is a plant would just grow and it would die. Tomatoes are not like that. Tomatoes have leaves that will continue to grow, and they need light in order to make that happen. So I have not done this. I have not heard of it, but I would say, first of all, if you want to try it, go for it. What have you got to lose? But second of all, you're going to have light to create that photosynthesis, and it's just not really, you're not providing it what it needs. And to make it even on top of that, it's not one of those plants. It doesn't need a chill period at all. It's basically a tropical plant. You know, if you grow it in zone 11, it's a perennial plant. It'll keep growing. Well, if it's an indeterminate. If it's determinate, doesn't matter. But an indeterminate tomato, it needs, it needs to continue to grow. It needs to have a continuous light source. So I don't think that this is a good method. But that being said, I give it a shot.
Yeah,
Batavia the Botanical loves a good garden experiment. She says it
I surely
herself
do.
all the time.
Hmm.
But
Yeah,
don't have your hopes set too high.
I get the concept of like there's some moisture that you're retaining here, like you're keeping this thing alive, with the minimum requirements. I just don't even know if you're really meeting the minimum requirements. And then for the record, I do put things like clearly things that have come from outside go into my refrigerator, carrots, right? Clearly, like, I put seed potatoes if I'm saving potatoes for my harvest. So I don't, they're clearly things, and sometimes they're not the exact cleanest, but something that you're expecting to continue to grow is not something that I would put into your point, refrigerator tomato plants or pepper plants even. Their demands are a bit different than stratification process for like garlic. Some people use, and they put those,
Yeah. We have to do a
cloves
pre-chill
inside.
period
Yeah,
for garlic. And
yeah,
but again, it doesn't have leaves at the time, all that
yeah.
stuff. So I've definitely heard of people
Those
doing this,
shoots.
but it's a
Mhm,
totally different type of plant. It's a
mhm,
deciduous plant, trees, anything like that. And I mean, I've got what is it called? An American beauty berry bush, I believe I have in my yard, and it loses all of its leaves. And so
mhm.
what that tells me is it does not need light to survive. So we can, you know, we could, if it were to get too cold here, which it doesn't, but if it were to get too cold, we could take that, bare root it, put it in the fridge, and then replant it. So that is an option for that. But for tomatoes, peppers, really anything in the garden, I don't really think that it's a viable option. Now, the only other option would be adding light into the refrigerator. But even then, if you add the light, then it's something that like you're going to be using water. So you're going to have to water it. It could be a nightmare. And I just don't want you to have to go through that process. But give it a shot. I mean, if you can keep the rootstock alive, why not? But it's a function of the plants. The photosynthesis. It's the life cycle that we're just not going to be meeting the requirements for.
And if somebody else has a different experience, a positive experience with this, go over to the Backyard Gardens Community Garden Facebook page and start a post on it so we can
Absolutely.
help Aaron out.
Absolutely. Yeah. Head over. And I mean, Aaron, if you're on Facebook, go over there and let us know how it goes if you're doing it. So, great question. I think there's definitely a craze in overwintering, and I get it, but it's just not for me.
Mhm,
So I don't
mhm.
really do overwintering. I enjoy the seed starting process. I'm guilty. What can I say? So,
Starting anew, yeah.
yeah. All right. So if you want to be like Aaron and you want to send us a question, you can do so on the Backyard Gardens Community Garden Facebook page, or you can do it through bygquestion@gmail.com. We would love to have your questions. I do enjoy them, especially stuff like this. It makes me think outside of the box. And I know Batavia does too. So we get some interesting questions for sure. But thank you, everybody, for listening. And if you're on YouTube, thank you for watching us. It is a learning process. So thank you for working with us. Check out the Planter app if you need to have something in order to get your garden going into another direction for next year and plan a little bit better. And also come buy some seeds from us. We love to have you. We have all kinds of seeds from tomatoes and peppers and corn, all the way down to lettuces and radishes and all that good stuff. And use the code. It's not going to be available forever. So use the code and we will get you some seeds. So, and remember, on this show, we do one thing, actually two. We learn to grow and we grow for change.
See ya.